And with that said, we're on to our headliner. Our headliner tonight is Stephen Lozier. As an assistant principal at Fishers High School, Stephen is driven to shock the world with what kids are capable of doing. He believes schools should be learning institutions focused on the co-creation of knowledge and skills and directly serve their communities by collaboratively solving real problems and challenges. When not at work, he stays up most of the night with his wife, caring for their 4 boys who are under 4 years old. Let's give him a sympathy round of applause as he comes to take the Spark stage. Come on, Stephen.
I mean, when your last name's Loser, you got to come out to that song. There is no other choice. So, and Zane and Emma don't get that at all, but that was my moment. So, my name is Stephen Lozier. It's not Loser. Lozier in German actually means problem solver, which I think will make some sense as my talk goes on. And so, the focus of my time today is to really talk about why and how Fishers High School gives students like Zane and Emma opportunities in our classrooms and in our community to communicate better and to serve those people around them, and how we create curricular examples of that. So I'm going to build on an analogy here. One of the things you need to know about me is in education, I think of myself kind of as a Trojan horse here. I think of myself as somebody who works within the system to change it. And that's the way that I've always chosen to work within public education. One of the things you need to think about for this to make sense is that technological revolutions bring about new ages. Another TED Talk speaker, Sir Ken Robinson, says the driver of everything are advances in technology and demography. And my talk is really focused on how those two things are driving what needs to change within our schools, our classrooms, and our communities. So education should be at the tip of that spear instead of always being reactive or responsive to technology and demography changes. So why? Let's talk about ages and revolutions, how those build to each other. So we start with the agricultural age, right? 10,000 BC to the 1800s, thousands of years of time happening there where that age comes along and technology shifts it. We move into the industrial age, a couple hundred years. Time gets compounded there, make a note of that. Ultimately to the information age, which started in the 1950s, and now currently, according to the research, and this is just one example of research, we're in the conceptual age, which needs creators and empathizers, pattern recognizers, and meaning makers. So, education is no longer about content knowledge, it's what you can do with it. And you've seen some examples of that already this evening. And so as an educator, we're challenged with being very responsive to those technological advances. There's a curve I was going to illustrate of knowledge doubling. And in that initial stage, knowledge is now doubling every year. The amount of information that is out there. So it becomes more about how do you discern and make sense out of that information, ultimately apply and use it for your own purposes, as opposed to the retention of that information. Part of the problem is our system of education is built on the retention of that information that came out of the Industrial Revolution. And we haven't even caught up to the information age, nowhere near the conceptual age. But we're going to change that. I'm not going to act like a math teacher. That was my illustration. So I use this analogy about the engagement gap and the achievement gap. And early in my career working in schools of poverty, I would explain that we can no longer close the achievement gap with struggling students until we first close the engagement gap. And I explained that we had to find out what drove kids, what were their passions, and hook the curriculum to those things if we were ever going to get them to achieve something. Now, something happened when I changed and moved to Fishers High School. I had somebody in that organization ask me, what happens when you don't have an achievement gap? I went, oh my goodness. According to the metrics that are in place, there is not an achievement gap in an affluent community like Fishers. But I want to make the argument that there might still be an engagement gap, right? So the way that builds is that we need to build classrooms that serve communities, that solve problems and challenges that exist there, and allow kids to develop what Zane talked about with communication is one of the 21st century skills, those success skills, those soft skills that make those sort of things happen. So how do we do it? Fishers High School is committed to creating classrooms of collaborative problem-solving spaces where kids can customize their experiences there and ultimately apply and use knowledge at a high level of rigor. Teachers take on the role as a co-creator or co-facilitator of that knowledge. And then ultimately, what kids don't just need to leave Fishers High School with a diploma, they need to leave with marketable, curricular-based experiences that set them apart from every other kid in our building, 3,300 kids, with that diploma. So what can they point to that they've done with what they've learned? How does that fit? Ultimately, gets to a point of how do we retain our talent in Fishers by engaging them with the problems or the challenges that exist right there in that community. So we create classrooms first, built on the coffee house idea, where students are active instead of passive. They're creating instead of completing or replicating. They're producing instead of consuming things, processing instead of memorizing, collaborating instead of working in isolation. Ultimately, they're autonomous, passion, purpose-driven learners as opposed to being dependent, and they're always asking instead of answering. They're using student-driven inquiry for their own purposes that also align and meet curricular targets. And so what do teachers do in that role? And this is one of the biggest shifts in my job. But they're acting as listening, facilitating, and process experts more than they are content experts now. When I have to work with teachers in professional development, I have to really clearly say, you were never taught this way, and you were never taught to teach this way. But this is where we have to shift and make those changes. So this is what our classrooms look like. Zane hinted at this. They are collaborative spaces. There are tables that are mobile. The chairs move. These are glass mobile walls that collapse and come together and allow for kids to collaborate. Every surface in this space is able to be written on with a whiteboard marker. And so these were modeled after Google and Apple, the places where this type of learning and processing and growth are happening is what this space was modeled after. It's a pinch me situation from a leadership standpoint in the sense my school built the facilities to make this education happen as opposed to shifting education to create the need for the facilities. And it's awesome every single day. And these are kids using the space, working on projects that they're passionate about and driven by. So I wanted to give an example of just one of these many instances that are happening in our building. And so this was an event last February called The Journey of Hope. You need to know something about Fishers High School. It is very, very connected to Riley Dance Marathon, where they raise money for cancer research. It's a huge club. They'll have call-out meetings of anywhere 200-300 kids engaged with this work. And if you're familiar with Riley Dance Marathon, it is a culminating event that raises money for Riley, where kids dance for universities at 24 hours. Ours lasts, I think, 12 hours. And so that's been a big part of Fishers culture for years. Knowing that club culture was so big, we moved into creating a curricular experience based around it. So these are some examples of the actual event where we raised $56,000, just over $56,000 for Riley Hospital. But here's how the curriculum fits with that. So we had 31 teachers kind of step up and say, you know what, I would love to build some curriculum into that event. And so they created project-based learning units. And so just for a structure of project-based learning is you give kids a real-world problem or challenge that engages them, and then you create a know and a need to know list. And from that, you coach in the curriculum of what kids need to know. And so examples up here were for biology. Design an interactive exhibit that shows participants all we know and do not know about how cancer spreads at the cellular level. We looked at cancer and healthy eating and biomed interventions. But then the whole idea of this is there's a whole human element to cancer, right? There's the scientific perspective, but there's a human element. And so students took the scientific understanding of that and then built into it where ultimately, how are ways that we can cope with the human side of the issue of cancer, which resulted in ceramics making beautiful art out of ugly cancer cells into some mosaic pieces. We had AP Psych look at cancer's impact on the human psyche and how they can cope. We had PE and health. How can yoga be used to both prevent and deal and cope with cancer? And then all these other ways to cope with that into these interactive experiences that ultimately looked like this. And so it becomes about not just what you know, but what you can do with it, what students can do and how they can collaborate and problem solve to make a bigger difference in their community and in the world. To not just get the content knowledge and the expertise, but to get those marketable experiences that set themselves apart and ultimately leave a lasting, shifting impression on their community that ultimately, in my hope, keeps them there, keeps them engaged, and it continues to engage our school as a problem-solving, collaborative institution. Thank you.